Well, good evening, church family. It's so good to be with you on this Saturday evening. Excited to finish our series, Great is the Lord, this evening. And also excited because next week, hopefully, we'll get to see you in person. And so on June 6th, so next Saturday, a week from today, we're actually going to open back up our services for the weekend. Just excited to celebrate, and hopefully you can come join us. Again, we'll still be going online if you're still uncomfortable with coming this way, but if you can and you are able and you are willing, we will have our Saturday night service, and we'll be actually in the worship center still in order to maintain social distancing. It's going to be a really good time. But if you haven't been with us, maybe you're just tuning in, we've been in a series called Great is the Lord. And so as we have looked at Great is the Lord, this is the last piece of it. We've looked at a number of different topics and really just how the attributes of God end up shaping our everyday living. And so we've looked at, we began and we kicked off our series looking at Yahweh, that our God is the great I am. There is no one like our God. Then the next week we moved into our God is love. And what does it mean to love? And we're actually going to pull a little bit from that teaching even this evening as we talk here in just a second. We also talked about then God's omnipresence, that God is everywhere. There's never been nor never will be a place where God is not or has not been. Then we moved into God's omniscience, that he is an all-knowing and wise God. And then we moved into God's faithfulness a few weeks ago, particularly in a Saturday night service, looking at the book of Joshua in chapters 1 through 7, that our God is continually over and over again faithful. And then last week, we looked at the omnipotence of God, that God is the all-powerful one. This evening, we turn to our final topic, and really it's two attributes of God's grace and God's justice. And we want to look at God being in his attributes. We want to see both of these sort of beginning to work together. Typically, when we talk about God's grace, most people are thumbs up, yes, absolutely. I love that our God is gracious. When we talk about God's justice, like we will here in a second, a lot of times we're far more hesitant to say that's the leading attribute that I'm going to pray about or that I'm going to run to when we think through God being just. And sometimes we operate or we speak or maybe even we desire that we think of God's grace and God's justice as almost two separate, let's say, coins. And you kind of hold them and they are constantly apart. And what we hope to do this evening as we walk through this is really see that they're just two sides to the same coin. That really it is God's grace and God's justice that work together to give us who our God is. And so that's the direction we'll be looking at this evening. And so we'll look at God's graciousness, we'll look at God's justice, and then we'll drive into some really practical elements toward the end of how do we be gracious people, and also how do we model God's justice. That's sort of the direction that we are headed. And so we're going to be in a number of different passages this evening. You'll see most of those on your device or on your screen, and you'll be able to follow along. And I hope that you can, maybe just jot some notes, or as always, if you want to send me an email, it's beau.landers, beau.landers @cottonwoodcreek.org. I'll be happy to send you my notes if you just want it for further resources. That's always available for you. But I want to begin tonight by looking at our first sort of point here, that our God is gracious. Our God is gracious. I want to start with God's grace and sort of maybe the one that we might even be a little bit more familiar with, and then move into his justice. But our God is gracious. And so as we've done before, what is grace? We have to define these attributes as we think through who our God is. And so when we talk about what is grace, B.B. Warfield, one scholar, said it this way, that grace is free sovereign favor to the ill-deserving. Another theologian named John Stott said that grace is love that cares and stoops and then rescues. I love that. He cares, and then he comes down to our level, and then he rescues us. That's what grace is. Another, Jerry Bridges, who I often run to, grace is God reaching downward to people who are in rebellion against him. And so really broadly, as we look at grace, we can use a number of those definitions. Very simply, I'll define grace as receiving what we don't deserve. Receiving a gift of what we don't deserve, in particular the grace of God, receiving salvation that we don't deserve. And really, when we're talking through God's grace, and the way I'll approach it this evening is I want to see God's grace almost as sort of combined with his mercy and his compassion and his forgiveness. I want to sort of see all of these. You can even think of it as sort of the good side of God if you want to think of it like that. But when we think about God being, what are those good attributes that we often run to? And so then we have the other side of grace, and sort of the complement of grace would be his mercy. His mercy. If grace is receiving something we don't deserve, mercy is then not receiving something that you do deserve. And so it's the opposite, but they work in conjunction with one another. They work hand in hand, truthfully. An example of this would be this. So if you think of God's grace, this is a gift to an undeserving person. A gift to an undeserving person, to where that person would basically say, well, what have I done to deserve this? That's the element of grace. For mercy, it's, again, not receiving something that you do deserve. And so I think of mercy. When I was in college, I was part of the traffic court in college. And so basically, as students came in and they got parking tickets, they would come to the traffic court to basically appeal their parking tickets so that they don't have to pay a fine. And so I remember this distinctly throughout my college days, because being on traffic court meant, number one, that I never got any tickets, regardless of where I parked or how I parked or anything like that. I was very merciful to myself. But the second thing is that to wield that kind of power was, there was something to it, to where if someone came in and pleaded their case, I had an opportunity to say, your sins are forgiven, dear brother. Right? And so there was power sort of in that, in thinking through that. But I could be merciful on who I wanted to be merciful. And then if some guy beat me in, intramural football, I'm sorry, buddy, you got to pay that ticket. And so in a joking way, that begins to understand how we can understand grace and mercy and how they begin to go hand in hand together. When we think of God's grace, specifically in light of our sin and our brokenness, we now start to combine other attributes of who our God is. Another, sort of to fill this out, because our God is gracious, that means that our God is a compassionate and loving God, is sort of your next sub-point to that. That he is a compassionate and loving God. Now we'll start to see different scriptures come forth, but in Psalm 145, verse 8 says, the Lord is gracious and compassionate. They're working together there. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and rich in love. So we talked about God being a loving God a few weeks ago, and so we mentioned that as a father has compassion on his children, so God has compassion on those who love him. This idea of compassion is one of sympathy and empathy. This idea of compassion you can translate and sort of think of another word as concern. So think of it this way, that the God of the universe has concern and care for you. Now we're starting to see, well, what did I do to deserve that? See how that's the grace and the compassion of God working together. And then further, it said that he is slow to anger, that his grace is ultimately modeled in how patient he is toward us, to where we should come out saying, but what did I do to deserve this? Nothing. That is the grace of God in our life. His slow to anger and his patience, it's not a picture of weakness, but it's a picture of love, that even in our mess-ups, even in our sin, even in our brokenness, God is constantly slow to anger. And so when we say that God is a father who has compassion, I don't know what your earthly father was like. I don't know if he was impatient and grumpy and quick to anger. I don't know what kind of parent you are, right? I don't know if you're impatient and grumpy and quick to anger, but our God is perfect, and he is patient, and he is slow to anger, and he is compassionate, and he is gracious, to where we walk out constantly going, but what did I do to deserve that? Nothing. Because that is the grace of God. Which then leads right into the next part of God being gracious. Not only is he loving and compassionate, then God is also forgiving God. That he is a forgiving God. Another psalm, there's a number of passages, obviously, when we're talking through God's forgiveness, but to stay in Psalms, Psalm 86, verse 5, it says, you, Lord, are forgiving and good, abounding in love to all who call to you. You are forgiving in good, abounding in love to all who call you. Our God is a forgiving God. It's a part of him being a gracious God. See, we love this picture of God with his arms wide open, basically saying, come to me and I will forgive you. Come to me and I will take care of you. Come to me and I will care for you and be compassionate for you. We love this picture of God. And so we don't typically have a problem with God's grace or God being gracious. We see this and we think, yes, that's exactly the God that I am talking about. We get a picture of Jesus even with soft skin and a big smile and rays of golden sunshine sort of surrounding him saying, come here, little buddy, I'll take care of you in this. And we like that picture of God, and that is very much the grace of God that we tend to run to. But where I want to press this evening and where I want to really push is we like God's grace because we like, quote unquote, the good parts of God. But we tend to steer clear of maybe some of these words, like God is just, that he's a judge, that he has judgment, that he's a jealous God, that he's a wrathful God against unrighteousness and sin, that he offers punishment for that. We like the picture of God being gracious and loving and compassionate and forgiving. We tend to steer clear of these other words like judgment and jealousy and wrath. But as we begin, I want to see, as I mentioned at the very beginning, that these are two sides to the same coin. That you can't have one without the other. They actually work together to create this perfect God, to give us a picture of this perfect God. And so I want to move now into the second major point, that God is not only gracious, but our God is just. That our God is just. Now, what is justice, right? We defined God's grace, basically receiving something that we don't deserve, to where we're basically asking the question, well, what did I do to deserve this? And nothing. That is God's grace. What is justice, right? Apart from maybe Batman or something else that you might have in your head right now, right? What is justice? And here's a definition that I want to offer you. It's concrete actions to take to correct unrighteousness and injustice. You could also say sin. So they're concrete actions that are taken to correct sin, injustice, unrighteousness, and ultimately to create righteousness, to make them right. So to take something that's been broken and make it right when we're talking about sin and unrighteousness and injustice. And so to understand God as just like we saw different attributes come out in his grace, like he is forgiving and he is compassionate and all of those, now when we see God as justice, there are other attributes of God that sort of help fill in him being just, that he is the perfect judge, that he is perfectly fair, that our God shows no partiality and he has no bias. He judges all equally. These are parts of what it means that God is just. See, this is actually the kind of God that we want. Could you imagine for a second if all of a sudden our God was biased or showed favoritism toward a certain kind of person or a particular kind of person? Right? You read through James and you read that is not at all who our God is. In fact, he urges us not to show favoritism among outsiders or people among you. But think for a second, if all of a sudden we had a picture of a God who was a judge who just kind of, he did whatever he felt like that day. He was kind to this person and he wasn't kind, and you really didn't know why. But God being the great judge means that he has a perfect standard. And this is a good thing. This is the kind of God that we want, and this is the kind of God that we need. We just don't like talking about it. So how is God just? How is God just? Well, first, that God's character, sort of what I'm going to say precedes him being just, but just so you can kind of see it, that God's character is perfectly holy. So we couldn't understand God being just if he himself was not perfect, right? And here's what we mean by holiness. That God is holy means that he is set apart, that there is no other like him. This is what we've been blowing up this entire series. Great is the Lord. There is no one like our God. He is the Holy One, set apart from all others. And we see that he is perfect, and in him there is no darkness, right? 1 John 5 says, in him there is not one little bitty ounce of darkness. It's like this, the way the original language is, it's like overblowing the idea that there is nothing wrong with our God. He is perfect. You get to a passage like Exodus chapter 34, and if you remember the scene, so the Israelites have left Egypt, and now Moses is getting, he has interceded on behalf of the Israelites for the golden calf incident in Exodus chapter 32. And then now in 34, Moses comes up to God. He's like, hey, God, here's what I want you to do for me. Show me your glory. God kind of scoffs, and he's like, you can't see my glory and live. Like, do you understand that, Moses? And you think, like, of all the people in history, Moses would be one of the top guys that would be able to see God in his glory if that were a thing. And God scoffs at him, and he says, you know what? You can catch the tail end of my robe, but that's it. Remember, he comes down from the mountain and his face is all red. See, when we think of God being holy, we think of God being perfect, we think that there is no one like our God. We have to see him in his holy perfection. One of the best passages, I think, that brings this out is in Isaiah chapter 6. This one you'll see on your device or on your screen right there. But in Isaiah chapter 6, where in modern worship sometimes we have these songs and these phrases that say, God, show me your glory. I don't think that's actually such a good idea. Listen to Isaiah chapter 6. Verses 1 through 5, it says, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Right, so just this robe is filling the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces. So not even these majestic creatures could see God, but they covered their faces. With 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, here's our word, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds. So God's not even talking here. It's the angels that are surrounding him. They begin singing this song, and at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Verse 5, woe to me, Isaiah cried. I cried, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Now, if we see this is the picture of our perfect and holy God, this sort of sets the stage for how we understand God to be just, how we understand his perfect judgments, because he himself is perfect in righteousness. If we think through this awesome scene, right, this all-filled scene, we see a few things that obviously in this time, there was a time to change for God's people. Isaiah the prophet gets a glimpse of God's glory. Who's there? There's these majestic angels, literally translated from the Hebrew. They're these burning ones. These burning ones, they're bright and they're vibrant. What are these angels saying? They're saying, holy, 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 because they have nothing else to say other than, God, you're set apart, you're set apart, you're set apart. There's no one like you. There's no one like you. There's no one like you. What's happening in the surrounding? Everything is shaking. There's smoke filling the temple. It's a dramatic scene. And in light of God's glory, what does Isaiah say? He looks at the scene. He looks at the angels. He looks at the robe of God, and he says, woe to me. For I have unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. I am ruined, he says. That means that I am in sin. Everyone around me is in sin. The Almighty has put his holiness on display, and God's holiness ultimately magnified Isaiah's sin. When we think of God being just, what basically sets the stage for that is that he is holy in his perfection and in his character. That when we see God, we can't live, from Exodus 34. Or as Isaiah says, when we see the fullness of God, when his glory is on display, ultimately Isaiah says, the only thing that I can call out is how much of a sinner I am. That is the God who we worship. We love to talk through the grace-filled God, talk about the grace-filled, and that's absolutely an aspect of who our God is, that he is loving and that he is forgiving. But let me say this, that is actually highlighted to the nth degree when we understand how holy our God is at the beginning. Because when we understand the holiness of God or get glimpses of the holiness of God, that's only going to magnify his grace toward us. That's what we begin to see through this. To understand God's justice, we have to understand God's holiness. For God's justice to make sense, we have to see his perfection. We don't like the idea of God's justice because we don't like the judgment aspect of it. Ultimately, our question always, right? Somebody judges you. Well, who are you to judge? But when we see God in his holiness, we see quickly that he who judges us is the only one who actually can. And while we don't like getting called out on our stuff and our sin and our brokenness and what's going on, when we see God as holy, we see, oh, he's actually the only one that can call me out on what I'm doing because he's perfect and I'm not. I am ruined. And that leads us right then into this next point of God's justice. That God is holy, but then God is right to judge us in our sin. That's your next subpoint right there. That God is right then, because of his holiness, he is right to judge us in our sin. Because God is holy, only perfection can have a relationship with him. Did you catch that? Because God is holy, only perfection can have a relationship with him. See, we tend to think, oh, well, I just got a little bit of sin. That means that I can have a relationship with God. I can get into heaven if you think of it from that perspective. But then you say, oh, but if you got a lot of sin, then you're not going to get to heaven. You're not going to get to go spend eternity with God. It's just those with a little bit of sin that can really kind of manage it and keep it around. The thing is that it's perfect. It's perfection. It's perfectly holy. It's perfectly righteous. That is the only thing that approaches the throne of God and lives, so to speak. And so really, God is right to judge us in our sin. Listen to Romans chapter 2. We know Romans 3, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but listen to Romans 2 right here, verse 5. But because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. See, our God is a jealous God, and he desires your full and perfect devotion. But sin is holistic. It is indwelling. It's a part of each of us, and we have all fallen short of the glory of God. And in light of God's holiness, the only appropriate response is to see what we saw in Isaiah chapter 6. I am ruined. We should feel the weight of our sin when we really begin to reflect on God's holiness and his justice. See, our culture's problem with grace and justice is that we think that we, right, and maybe just personalize this, I think that I deserve God's grace somehow or another. But remember what grace is. It's getting something you actually don't deserve. So if you think you deserve God's grace, then you're actually not getting God's grace, right? That's a complicated system right there. But we think that we deserve God's grace. And here's the other side. When we think about God's justice, we think everyone else deserves God's justice. What we tend to do is that we internalize and we desire and we want God's grace. And then when we look at everyone else, we're like, yeah. And they need God's judgment. That's what we do. Whether we say that out loud or we think it implicitly, that's often how we think. That it's this give me grace and give them justice. Right? I've seen some of you drive. I know you're thinking that. Right? And this is your thought. You get cut off. What do you want? Retribution. Right? You want that person to suffer. And so you lay on a really long horn. However you think of it, they did wrong and so they need justice. But you're texting at a green light, right? And you're sitting there stopped and the green light has come on and somebody honks behind you and what do you want? Grace. Oh, come on, man. It was just a quick text. I'm sorry. Same thing happens, right? But the person in front of you, what are you going to do? You're going to call out and cry out for justice. It's implicit to us. This is what we want. We want others to have justice, and we want the grace. We do this in all of our relationships as well. We want these attributes of God so long as they benefit us, so long as they are on our terms. But think for a second, what if God, all right, so we want this grace, what if God was full of grace and yet lacked justice? Well, he would deny his very perfection, because all of a sudden, as we talked earlier, he would be a partial judge. And that's not at all. Think of it in the context of a courtroom. You want a fair and equitable judge. But then what if God was full of justice and then lacked grace? Well, then you get hellfire and brimstone without any hope of restoration. He would zap you, basically, at any point that you would get out of line. Yet God is both just and he is gracious. So how do we begin to balance these? Here's your next point right here. God's grace and God's justice are on full display in the cross. God's grace and his justice are on full display in the cross. If we keep reading from Romans in chapter 3, beginning in verse 21, and what I'll do is I'll read a few verses and then I'll comment on them, and then we'll keep working through this. But this is what it shows us, that God's grace and justice are on full display, that they work together in tandem. Romans 3:21. It says, "But now, apart from the law of righteousness of God has been made known," right? So, but now, apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. Basically, righteousness is standing right before God. What did Isaiah do? Well, in light of God, in light of who he is, he can't stand rightly before God, right? That's what this is saying. All right, and then you keep reading in verse 22. This righteousness is given through faith. All right, so then in order for you to stand right before God, it's given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference between Jew and Gentile, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. You see, the words grace and justice are working in both, and in these verses together to show you, you can't stand right before the Lord. You can't do it. But Jesus comes in, and through faith in Jesus, he can justify you through his justice, because he took the wrath that was reserved for you. And because the judgment of God has now been placed on Jesus and not on us, what happens then? We are able to walk in salvation, and we experience his grace. You see how these are working together. If you keep reading in verse 25, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance, he had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so as to be just. I love this. This is why God did it. To be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. Did you catch that? And I love this. He is the just and the justifier. He's the one who judges you in your sin, yet because of the work of Jesus, you now can be made right before the Lord. And he doesn't compromise his justice. Instead, his grace is on full display. He is holy and gracious because of the punishment reserved for sinners has been satisfied on Jesus. Do we see this? See, in Jesus' life and death, he holds together God's grace and his justice, offering salvation to all who call upon his name. To highlight only God's love is to create an unjust God, one who is not concerned about making things right. To highlight only justice is to create an unloving God, one who has no concern for his creation. Jesus brings these together. He satisfies the wrath of God in a way that is perfectly permanent. That's the work of Christ. And so what does this mean for us? This means that your sin is forgiven through the death of Jesus. Believe that and you will be saved. This is why Jesus is the only way to the Father. Jesus' death is final. He doesn't keep going on to the cross. It is done. While sin still exists, he has called you into his freedom. Allow the cross to begin to transform us. That's the beauty of the gospel. And that's where we see it. That you who are judged rightly in your sin, just like Isaiah was in Isaiah 6, just like we saw from Moses in Exodus chapter 34, you are judged rightly in your sin, but because of the work of Jesus, you can stand before the Father. And if you've never done that, if you never believed and called upon the name of the Lord Jesus to be saved, what is stopping you? Because without Jesus, you are judged rightly in your sin. And you stand condemned before God, and you say, I am ruined, and then you are punished. But on the other side, we say, I am ruined, and Jesus comes in and covers us with his blood, covers us with his forgiveness, covers us with his grace. And we're left asking the question, what did I do to deserve this? Nothing. That's the grace of God being amplified because we understood the justice of God. That is our salvation. That passage in Romans ends in verse 27, in 3:27. It says, where then is boasting? It is excluded. Because of what law? The law that requires works? No, because of the law that requires faith. For we maintain that a person is justified by faith apart from works of the law. You can't make yourself right before God. You can't justify yourself. Only Christ does that. So where do you stand? Do you stand in his justice, apart from his grace, or in his justice, surrounded by his grace? That becomes our question. But I know many of us who are tuning in right now have walked that path of faith a long time ago, or maybe even shortly, but you've been a believer, and you are a believer, and you've been walking in that, and you've understood maybe even how God's justice and how his grace work together to bring about your salvation. So then what for us? Remember this whole series as we talk about great is the Lord. We say how the attributes of God end up shaping our everyday life. So as God is the just one and the gracious one, how do those attributes end up shaping our life? What has he called us to as believers? And if you've walked through salvation, you've been saved, and you've been filled by his Spirit, let me just offer you 2 points right here. That we are called to ultimately, point number 1, we are called to model his grace. So how do the attributes of God affect and shape our everyday living? Well, number 1, we're called to model the grace that we've been given. I love Colossians 3 right here. Colossians 3, beginning in verse 12. It says, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved. So in light of you understanding that you have been justified by the cross, that you have been made right, not because of your own actions, but because of the actions of Jesus himself, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, here's what we have been called to do right here. Clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. If we pause right there for just a second, we'll go back to 13 in a minute, but if we pause right there, as a believer, you have an opportunity then to clothe yourself with all of these things, with compassion, in other words, a concern for others, with kindness, a benevolent attitude or action toward others, with humility, understanding that life isn't about you, with gentleness. This idea of gentleness is, again, not weakness, but it's this self-control that you have. And with patience, ultimately modeling the patience that's been given to us. You see, as believers, when we model God's grace, we look to God's grace that has saved us, and we say, that is how I am to act toward everyone else. Because when we understand God's grace over here, that then affects us in how we live. Further, keep reading verse 13. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you has a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. Verse 14. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. In addition to all those attributes in verse 12, we get two more traits that are listed: to bear one another, in other words, endure one another. And this idea of forgiveness. Bearing with one another is ultimately the practice of patience with one another. Because our relationships are always with sinners, right? So any person that you come in contact with is also a sinner. That means that the only way to live out a life of patience is through forgiveness. And you see how these are working together. This is a life of grace. A life of grace, modeling God's grace, is a life of forgiveness. If you remember the parable that Jesus says of the man who had a great debt that had been forgiven, right? The man, he had a great debt to a ruler, and as he had this great debt, he knew that he couldn't pay it back. And so the king said, you know what? I'll assume it. You're forgiven. Your debt is forgiven. And the man rejoiced, and he went back home. And then he had another guy approach him, one of his servants who owed him just a little bit of money. And if you remember, he doesn't act graciously, but instead he ends up beating this servant and calling and trying to threaten him in that process. And the king catches wind of this, and he says, why would you, who have been forgiven so much, try and pull that off with this servant who's been forgiven, who has just a little bit of debt? And what Jesus uses in this parable is to remind us, if we understand just how much, again, the holiness of God, his justice on display, yet also his grace, why would we not model that grace and forgiveness to others? We've been forgiven a great debt. As we think of our interactions with others, we're to model that same grace. We're to have grace in our marriages. This means that we need to understand that you need forgiveness just as much as your spouse needs forgiveness. That's one of the most revolutionary ideas that we got in premarital counseling. When we think we have a problem, what do? They're wrong. Grace says, hey, remember, you're a sinner too. You've been forgiven much. You're also gracious in your parenting. In other words, allowing your kids to make mistakes, forgiving them, and using them as teaching moments, not as moments of ridicule. Because graciousness is ultimately wrapped in compassion and forgiveness. We're gracious toward coworkers. We're giving people the benefit of the doubt. See, what all this in our relationships, when we understand just how much we've been forgiven, we now walk in that same forgiveness and in that same grace. Typically, when we talk through how is a believer supposed to act, we love Colossians 3 in these kind of passages. We love to talk through how a believer is supposed to walk in grace. But I want to also move to the final point here, that in addition to being called to model his grace, we're also called to model his justice. We're called to model his justice. There's a number of passages we could have turned to, but I want to read a few. The minor prophets in particular are all speak volumes into this idea of justice. But we as God's people are called to model his justice, to model his righteousness, called to model and fixing sin and brokenness in this world. Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So if we pause right here, this is not a call for some sort of arrogant justice where you are the high and the mighty judge of all this world. This is not a call to replace God's judgment. This is to act justly. It's combined with these two ideas right here in Micah chapter 6. To also love mercy. Remember, not getting what you do deserve, that idea of being merciful toward everyone. And also to walk in humility, because you ultimately aren't God. God is God. And so to act justly is combined with this idea to love mercy and walk humbly. Many of the prophets drive us back to this call of living and walking in justice. Zechariah chapter 7, 9 through 10, you'll see it here. It says, this is what the Lord Almighty said, administer true justice, show mercy and compassion to one another. Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless, the foreigner or the poor. Do not plot evil against each other. Each time, the Lord is reminding his people through the prophets that you have been chosen and we have been called out as God's people to live and pursue justice, equity, and righteousness on this earth, to be different. Remember that holy God that we talked about at the beginning? Because of his perfection, we as God's people have a call to model that similar and same kind of holiness. And so what this means is it's not to be passive or powerless under the oppression and bondage of injustice and sin, but ultimately to stand as a lighthouse for every weary traveler, that this is not the way it should be. That's what we have, and that's our responsibility in living a Christian life all this week. The name of George Floyd has been everywhere. A few weeks prior to that, we hear of Ahmaud Arbery. Covered the news outlets. Why are we hearing these on social media? Why are we seeing these on our news outlets? They're cries of injustice. They are absolute cries of injustice that something is not right here. People created in the image of God, seemingly outed because of their skin color. I want to be very clear here. I'm not speaking from a political stance. I'm speaking from a theological and a biblical one. All people have been created in the image of God. See, our value is not tied into, our worth is not tied into our skin color, in our abilities, in how much money we have, and what we bring to the table, but by the Maker who we reflect. That's where our value and our worth come from. And as believers, when we see injustices, we must be that lighthouse in the midst of a storm, in the midst of chaos, in the midst of secular turbulence that honestly, what they're trying to do is pine for opportunistic exploitation of tragic events. Instead, what we have a call to do is to call it like it is, injustice. Not because we are God, but because He is God. Time and again, injustice continues. Abortion and injustice toward the unborn. Sex trafficking and injustice on women and boys and girls, the helpless. Child abuse and injustice for the defenseless. Elder abuse and injustice toward those who can't help themselves. And we as Christians, as believers who have experienced the very justice and the grace of God, have a call to model God's justice both mercifully and humbly. How do we do this? I'm going to end with this passage, and we still have just a little bit to go, but in Romans 12, if you want to underline this passage, circle this passage, if you haven't gone to this, Romans 12, beginning in verse 9 through 21, speaks directly to this. How do we live? How do we begin to pursue God's justice? I'm going to go over it quickly, but I encourage you this week, read this passage over and again and ask yourself hard questions. Am I living in this way? Romans 12, verse 9, love must be sincere. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of these verses, offer a little bit of commentary, but first and foremost, love must be sincere. What is sincere love? That we care about all of these things. How? Then you keep reading verse 9. Hate what is evil and cling to what is good. See, we should detest injustice. We should hate injustice. Remember Isaiah, if you're okay with sin, then you have minimized God's holiness. If you're okay with sin, if you're fine with it lingering around, then you have minimized God's holiness. Verse 10, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves. What is that? Walking humbly. Verse 11, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. See, as we hate evil and as we cling to the good, we're called to keep doing it. This is one of the series that we're looking at next week. We're going to keep on keeping on, how to persevere in the Christian life. In the midst of the mundane, in the midst of the trials, in the midst of everything, how do we keep moving? That's exactly what we're talking about here. Then you get to verse 12, be joyful in hope. See, when we come here, here's our marching orders. What do we do in the midst of injustice? Right here, verse 12. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, and faithful in prayer. What do we do about justice? How do we model God's justice? We recognize sin as sin. We approach it humbly, see, because we're not God, He is God, and we fervently hope and we pursue resolution. We be patient while fighting injustices, and we be faithful in prayer the whole time. Then you get to a few more practical steps. At verse 13, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. To spot injustice and not do these is to not let your love be sincere. All right, flip that to the positive side, right? When we do these, we are letting our love be sincere. Keep reading in verse 15. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. See, sincere love rejoices with righteousness, and sincere love weeps over sin, over brokenness, and over injustice. Verse 16.
Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people in low position. Do not be conceited. See, it's one thing to call out something on social media. It's a totally different thing to walk alongside of the oppressed and the vulnerable and the broken and the tattered and the profiled and the helpless. We walk the walk. But then here's the key to when modeling justice. You're not the judge, God is. Listen to verse 17. See, do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. Verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, you live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, and I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, here's what we're called to do. We are not God in this scenario. We are God's people. What are we called to do? If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. See, in doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Verse 21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. What is grace and justice in the Christian life? It's our job to model God's care for justice in the world by living a life that's filled with grace. As we close, are you rightfully condemned because God is the just one, or have you been saved by the grace of God, where it has not compromised his holiness, instead his wrath has been satisfied on Jesus? And then next, if you have walked through salvation, how are you modeling his grace and justice? On August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream. Using some of his key phrases, here's some of what he declares. He says this, in a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check that has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that that bank of justice is bankrupt. Now is the time to make justice a reality, is what he says, for all of God's children. What he does then is he goes on and he describes the injustices of police brutality and moving from a small ghetto into a larger ghetto, for the for whites only sign during those times, the voting rights for Negroes. And then he says this, he says, no, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. And then he quotes a Bible verse right here. Amos chapter 5, I mentioned the minor prophets earlier. He quotes this, Amos chapter 5, verse 24. But let justice flow like water and righteousness like an unfailing stream. While Dr. King may have used this Amos passage in a slightly different way than the original intent, the heart for biblical justice is evident. Taking care of the poor and the oppressed, for the least of these, for those who can't take care of themselves, that is the very heart of the gospel message. And what Amos 5 brings out more than anything is that justice will come. Justice will come. And this is a great hope for believers, that all will be made right again. In the meantime, while Dr. King was speaking in 1963, I think there is still a need for justice in a variety of areas in our world. The racial issue is still a divide. Equal pay, equal opportunity. Mixed also with this is the gender issue, crying out for much the same. There's cries for pro-life, justice for the unborn. But then there's also the other side of cries for life that we need to care about, that there are 500,000 foster kids in this nation. Justice for their lives as well. Or what about the fact that 1 in 5 kids in North Texas lives in poverty? May we be people overwhelmed by God's grace to not only see injustices, but act on those injustices with the grace of the gospel. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your word. Lord, I thank you that you speak to troubled times like we're living in. Lord, and I pray that as believers, we see the two-sided coin of your grace and your justice. May we not be a people who walk arrogantly in justice. May we not be a people who are blind to injustices, but may we walk humbly in justice and mercifully so that you are on full display. Not so that we would take your place as the great judge, but so that we would point to you as our judge. I thank you for the gospel. I thank you for your grace. I thank you that I can stand before your throne not condemned, not judged, not because you have compromised your justice, but because your wrath has been placed on Jesus. We love you. It's in your son Jesus' name we do pray. Amen. It's been great being with you this Saturday evening. As always, I can't wait to see you, and that's going to happen just next week. And so go ahead and make plans to join us back 5 o'clock in the worship center as we worship Saturday night, and we kick off a brand new series, Keep On Keeping On. Beyond that, you guys have a great week.